Good morning, survivors. This is Ian.
What's up? This is Paul.
We're back for episode 2 of the Surviving Central City podcast. So first off, thank you to everyone who has taken the bullet and subscribed and getting notifications on YouTube or downloaded through your favorite podcast app. We've gotten some good feedback, and we're continuing to try to improve production and getting some good ideas about content and delivery for the future.
Yeah. Thanks everybody for subscribing. We got a lot of great feedback too and comments on our Twitter account at Surviving CC, on the YouTube channel, Surviving Central City. So we appreciate all that too.
So I guess before we get started, what's going on with you?
Busy. We've been busy. Not a whole lot. I mean, I guess I say I'm busy and then I say not a whole lot going on with me. The usual stuff. It's the typical. We've been doing a lot with community lifelines. Actually, funny enough, we were in a meeting together this past week, and you brought up community lifelines. And I don't think you and I have talked about community lifelines at all. And that's something we'll talk about. That's not for today to talk about in depth what that is. But it was interesting to me that our minds work the same, I feel like, because
it's terrifying.
Yeah, like I was working on community lifelines in Fairfax. You're working on it with an IMT thing, and it's like we I think kind of branched in our own directions, but both in the same topic area, which I thought was kind of cool. So, working on that. And other than that, it's just, it's September, National Preparedness Month. Shout out to all those folks in community engagement. I know we got a team out there today as we're recording this.
Why aren't you
Fairfax? Because I'm not in community engagement. So shout out to those folks. You know who you are doing all that work, and we appreciate the effort there. So.
And if you need Paul to come help, make sure you text him and ask.
Yeah, and I'll make sure it's on silent.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so for me, it's been I've been sick all week. So I went to a conference, and this is a kind of a tangent from the past, but went to a conference about 5 years ago, and I got on the plane with like a congested sinuses.
Yeah.
And so while I was on the plane, my eardrum perforated. So like miserable conference, whatever. But I've got a history of allergies. So the guy told me, every time you get on a plane, take Sudafed and use Afrin.
Okay.
And Afrin's the one that's like you get addicted to it. It's it'll do the job. It'll clear you out, but
you just can't use it a lot.
Yeah. So we've had the whole house sick, and I got a 2-year-old Shane, and he was sick, and I had been avoiding the sickness, and all of a sudden Shane's sick, and he wants a hug, he gets a hug, and here I am sick. Right. But my point was this morning I did the Sudafed and Afrin routine, and I could feel like just everything, my whole brain like opened. I got fresh air, and it was pretty amazing. Other than that, it's been an interesting week. As you mentioned, we had an IMT meeting, which is always good. We had about 65 people at that.
Yeah.
So good stuff there. And I guess I could go on for hours about just what's going on with me, and nobody wants to hear that garbage. So,
I don't know. Maybe they do. I don't know.
Yeah. We'll see. They can put it in comments on YouTube then.
Right.
We'll answer questions. Right. Also, I have to give respect to Ohio State, who beat Notre Dame last Saturday.
Yes.
It was actually a better game than I was fearing it was going to be. Notre Dame basically controlled the game until the fourth quarter, where Ohio State was just like, hey, we're better than you, and ended up winning 21-10.
Yep.
So I can't talk the trash to the individuals that I was originally
which would have been cool.
It would have been cool.
nice.
Yeah, it would have been nice because they never play. I think they only played like 4 times.
Right.
But they play again next year, so fingers crossed. I don't have to wait a whole year for that.
Yeah.
So today we're going to be doing kind of the history of emergency management. This is the abridged version, so it's like Bram Stoker's Dracula, but abbreviated. So we're going to talk about things, and we're going to touch on surface level on a lot of topics about kind of how we got to where we are and the way things work now. And there's going to probably be some stories mixed in as we're talking about legislation and things that happened in the past. And again, if you have questions, if you don't think we're clear on something, or if you're one of those college-educated emergency management brainiacs that wants to tell us we're wrong about something, definitely open to that. We don't want to give out bad information, but our intent is not to give out every detail on everything we cover. The intent is to give a broad overview of what's going on.
Yeah. It's like the highlights.
Yeah, the highlights. Yeah, and none of it's good. Changes in emergency management don't happen because something went well.
Yeah,
it always comes when something went terribly, and then Congress basically has to do something differently. So I think the way we've organized this is Paul's going to kind of cover the early years of emergency management. And then I'm going to take some of the more recent years, and we'll be chiming in, back and forth. So while Paul's talking, I'm just going to be drinking coffee, sipping the tea. And
what? I'm going to carry us. All right, got it.
You always do. Yeah, you carry us. So.
Yeah. I am curious, since neither one of us actually have a college education in emergency management, if this is something that's taught. I'm sure it is. It's probably a course you take if you take like a master's degree or even a bachelor's degree in emergency management or homeland security, something like that. I'm sure there's a class on like the history of emergency management. So if anyone's taken that class, feel free to chime in the comments on our YouTube channel and clarify anything too if we misstep on some of this stuff. But we did a lot of, at least I did a lot of research. I don't know if you did in this week.
What are you trying to say?
I'm just saying, carrying now. No, I did, a bunch of research on the history because I wasn't that familiar with, like, I know some of the highlights going into this too, but I didn't know all of the different milestones, I would say, in the history of emergency management and how we kind of got to here. And it was interesting to me to kind of see things that, like, we know happen today kind of normally, where they kind of came from and how they evolved over time to kind of get to where we are. And it took a long time to get to this point, I would say, because we're talking about the very first event where we, I think, as a profession, kind of universally recognized as the birth of modern day emergency management, I guess you could say, is Portsmouth, New Hampshire, they say 1803. I guess that's when Congress passed this legislation for the very first time to assist or provide assistance to a locality, in this case, the city of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, due to a large fire. Right, it was the fire actually occurred on Christmas in 1802, if I got that correct. So, big fire in the 1800s. A lot of construction in the city area, which is a port city, is wood, and so a fire breaks out, and half the city burns down from the fire, and it was devastating to the economy in the city. And so Congress recognized the impact financially, I guess, to Portsmouth, and passed some legislation in the 1803 to assist with providing some recovery to Portsmouth, mostly in financial assistance. I think it was more actually suspending certain requirements of the merchants in Portsmouth to provide relief to them because of this event. So that's kind of always, from everything I've seen, that's like the beginning of Congress or the federal government acting in providing assistance to a locality. So prior to that, it was basically if something bad happened in your town, city, county, wherever you were, it was on that township, county government, whatever, to figure it out and work through, and the residents really to kind of work through the event. So this is the first time where the feds kind of step in and say, we got to help out here.
Yeah. And I don't have a specific example, but to add on to that, back during that time period, if something wiped out a town, a disaster, a lot of times they just abandoned the town and went and built a new one.
Right.
So, there wasn't a lot of support for the rebuilding or what we call recovery of certain communities. So that's, it's certainly a valuable part of what we do, but that's fairly recent in the grand scheme of emergency management, the idea that we're going to, rebuild this area that was affected back to where it was, or even better, hopefully. So a fairly new thing, but if you look it up, you can find specifically in the Midwest and out West, these either floods, fire, stuff that came through, and people just said, okay, moving on. We'll move a few miles down the road and try again.
Right. So, yeah. And so in this case, they rebuilt. And what I found interesting in this particular event is there were two more fires in the city of Portsmouth in the next decade, so the next 10 years after the initial fire.
Did they have a fire marshal?
Apparently not. And so they kept rebuilding the city, and then a fire broke out. And if I got this correct, I'm pretty sure the other two fires after the first one were also in the Christmas timeframe. So it was very odd how that, I don't know what they were doing at Christmas. Apparently they were lighting a whole bunch of candles and burning down the city. And so there were two additional fires that wiped out the city a second time, and then a third time in the next decade. The third and final fire was the most devastating, actually. So it wasn't the initial one where Congress passed the legislation. It was the third that was the worst. Because of the third fire, the city of Portsmouth actually put in an ordinance that all new construction to rebuild the city the fourth time had to be brick. So that's interesting. I didn't see a lot of that referenced in my research, but I find that kind of interesting because that's maybe one of the earlier examples of, like you were saying, instead of kind of just picking up and moving on, the leadership in the city was like, hey, we got to do something to help prevent this from happening.
Leadership.
In the future. And so There you go, mitigation. That was the first time we would call that, a mitigating project, where they were going to say, hey, if we build things out of brick, it's harder to burn down brick. Maybe it won't burn down again. And I don't think there were any significant fires after that one.
Rocket surgery.
Fourth time was the charm on that. So yeah, after that, you kind of, from basically 1803 in the Portsmouth legislation, from between there and all the way up until, I would say, almost the Great Depression era in the 1930s, you kind of have this, I guess, ad hoc, method of the federal government kind of stepping in at times to provide passing legislation to provide assistance to cities, towns, local areas that are impacted by significant disasters. And there were a number in that time frame. There are a lot of other fires. There's a huge fire in Chicago. There's a big fire in New York City. The San Francisco earthquake. You had the Galveston, Texas hurricane, which I think was 1900, something like that. And so you had a number of these events, and it was kind of ad hoc. There wasn't really any formal process for requiring or requesting assistance from the federal government, and there wasn't really any mechanism for the feds to do this assistance unless somebody in Congress decided, or maybe a governor went to Congress and begged, like, hey, we need assistance. And they're like, okay, yeah, well, we agree. We'll pass some legislation for providing some assistance to you directly. And so that's kind of how it went. And then you get to the Great Depression era. And
can I jump in before you get to the Great Depression? So one of the other ones that happened in the 1800s, and this is every time anything happens on TV, whether they're watching Real Housewives of Orange County or the news, everybody has an opinion on what other people should be doing, right? And I've heard a lot of like, well, send in the military,
Yeah.
So every time something happens, they want to take this, if all you got's a hammer, everything looks like a nail, basically.
Yeah.
So they want to use the military to do just about everything, meanwhile diminishing, defense forces that are used for other things like defense.
Right.
So the one of the ones I wanted to cover is the Posse Comitatus Act. It was 1878. And the intent of that act wasn't the best intent, I'll say, but the effects of that ruling or that legislation are still in effect. So the Posse Comitatus Act was passed by Congress, who I believe at the time was a majority representative of the South at that time. And they basically passed the Posse Comitatus Act to keep federal forces from performing law enforcement missions, period.
Okay. Yeah.
So the underlying scheme here is this is during the Jim Crow era. And, the southern states, fresh out of the Civil War, are saying, yeah, we're slightly changing what we're doing, but we're still not being good people. And we don't want federal resources showing up and policing us about how we're treating minorities, basically, is my interpretation. Those are Ian's words of that ruling. But basically what it means, and it's still in effect, is that, you can't use federal resources meaning DOD, Department of Defense.
Right.
You can't use military to perform law enforcement actions in a non-federal, non-defense role, basically.
Right.
So there's a lot of stipulations and rules that comes back to that. I don't want to get into too much of how that works. I'll kind of save that for more modern day when we get there.
Mm-hmm.
But that's one other major ruling that definitely draws lines about what the federal government can and cannot do and will not do during disasters.
Right.
So, translation to now, without getting into the other rulings, is, the Department of Defense is the best logistics machine in the world.
Yeah.
Or at least it was until Amazon showed up. But the DOD is very good at logistics. And so outside of disasters, not performing law enforcement actions, that there's a lot of stuff they can do as far as moving resources, moving supplies, things like that. And they are used for that. But every time I see I just know people, I'll just say it that. I'm not going to stereotype anyone. I know people who every time they see something on TV where there's any type of civil disobedience, they're like, send SEAL Team 6, as if, the military is going to step in and all of a sudden become police officers for a town, which is, it's actually prohibited by law. So I just wanted to point that out before we jump too far into the 1900s.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And actually, I know we've talked about this before. I know it's a thing. Like I've known, like, yeah, you can't bring in the DOD or military for law enforcement roles. I didn't realize it went back that far. Like that's where it started, was going all the way back into the 1800s.
Well, when you say the word, like just the name of the act, like when I first heard it, and I think the first time I heard about this was in a class, like the 101 Academy, the Academy, whatever.
Yeah.
And so I heard it and I was like, Posse Comitatus just sounds sinister.
It does.
You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Having posse at the beginning,
right,
I'm like,
right.
okay, so I got to know more about this. And so the name itself stuck in my head because of the word posse.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
And there is some more, if you Google that, you'll find some more villainous stuff that was going on at the time.
Right.
So you just keep it in mind. But yeah, it's one of the interesting cases where, this, when it was passed, had bad intentions.
Right.
But it ended up being used for good, really,
yeah,
to really draw lines and make it more black and white as far as who's doing what instead of gray.
Yeah, that's a very good point. It's also interesting that that's still something that affects us today. It was enacted that long ago. So back to our little timeline. So we've got we're kind of in the early 1900s. We're still doing this kind of ad hoc federal government assistance as needed to disaster recovery efforts from different localities, and we get into the Great Depression era and the New Deal with FDR and the New Deal. There's just an enormous amount of legislation that's passed as a part of the New Deal effort to kind of revive the economy and get people working and all sorts of a slew of things that come out of the New Deal. But there are some things in legislation that are kind of weaved into some of the New Deal programs that really starts to create some, I would say, like federal legislation on a more permanent basis for rebuilding, reimbursing mostly public facilities and infrastructure related to disasters.
Right. So is that where public assistance came in?
Not quite.
Okay.
But yeah, you're kind of seeing some of the beginnings of public assistance, or at least what would become public assistance, I guess, at this point in some of the New Deal era programs. And I think a lot of it really, again, to your point with the military piece, this legislation really, I think, was garnered around trying to push money into the economy, get people working, like by rebuilding things.
Right.
And but the effect was, hey, now we actually have some legislation that's kind of in existence that funds certain programs, like giving funding to certain organizations in the federal government or agencies in the federal government that rebuild roads, right, if they're damaged by flooding. Right. And so they have now a mechanism to do that without having to pass special legislation each time. So you kind of see this starting to come up in the New Deal. Again, not really, I think, focused on because there's disasters. It's more of, hey, we're trying to get people to work. And one of those too, it's also kind of in that New Deal era is the 1936 National Flood Act, which creates the National Flood Program. Mm-hmm. So that's where you see that program, which we, now there's National Flood Insurance Program. There's more. It's expanded since then, but this is where you kind of see, I guess, some more formalization with the National Flood Program in that New Deal era, because of some flooding disasters that occurred during that era. And so that kind of, I guess, puts us on this path of, all right, now we're starting to create at the federal level some legislation that is more lasting for recovery efforts, and we get up into the now we're past the Great Depression era. We're starting to get into the 40s. There's a lot of war at this juncture in history, obviously, and so you see the rise of civil defense and the Office of Civil Defense and the Civil Defense Program, which is really a lot of I would say emergency management programs at the local level today, even, or at the state level. They will oftentimes trace their roots, I feel like, back to civil defense programs. And you'll see that's why a lot of logos you see related to emergency management programs are this triangle, or you see the triangle shape a lot of times in emergency management branding, which harkens back to the civil defense logo, which was a triangle. And that's where I guess a lot of their maybe more formal roots in preparedness, outreach to the community about, being prepared for nuclear attack or for invasion or whatever, air raid, like things like that, is where you really see the focus swing, right, completely to, I think, mostly civil defense because of the nature of the time with war.
Did you know, side note, more for Paul, the phone you have in the EOC, the NAWAS phone?
Yeah, the bat phone.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So when I started EOC, there were still people, this is 2000, I said EOC, DPSC, which is the 911 center, when I started there in 2001, there were people that had been around long enough, they still called it the civil defense phone.
Okay, yeah.
Because it was used at that time. And for those of you who don't know what it is, it's a white phone that basically all of the metropolitan Washington, D.C. area are tied into this phone, and it's a live line. So at any time you can pick up the phone and say, hey, this is going on, so on and so forth. It gets tested once or twice a day, but it's just like a constant link in communication. And it's there since before radios, before all this other stuff.
It's literally a copper line.
Right.
But
it was everybody lines. They'd say civil defense phone. I'm like, okay, boomer. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
But it was like people who had been there since like the 60s or 70s called it the civil defense phone.
Yeah, that's crazy.
And everybody else called it NAWAS or WAWAS. And that was the Washington area early warning system. Warning alert system, something like that. Yeah.
That's what it is. Yeah. Yeah, that's cool. I have not heard people say that, but I could definitely see the link between it. It's a lot of I think the more time you spend in the world of emergency management, eventually you will start to see. You'd be like, oh, if you look at civil defense and a lot of their programs from the era, you're like, oh, I see where this came from, or I see how this relates, or I see how this got to this point, especially when it comes to, I would say, outreaching and branding of emergency management today, because at the time, especially this time, you're really, I think, seeing an official program that's created, and it's a lot of funding being dumped into the state, the locals, on this concept of being prepared, and so that's going on in the 40s and and say even into the 50s. It doesn't really ever go. I mean, it doesn't completely disappear in the 60s or the 70s, but the focus swings back, I would say. So you have this wartime focus through civil defense in the 40s and 50s, and then in the 60s, 70s, and I'm using rough dates, obviously, like this isn't exact science here, but generally speaking, 60s and 70s, you're kind of seeing, less focus and discussion on war, up until, I guess, the Cold War, but you're starting to see a swing away from war, and then you're starting to see a gigantic number of major disasters in the 60s and 70s. And I meant to list a bunch of them down on my little note sheet that I have that I'm looking at, but I didn't. But I know for sure one of the ones that we talk about quite a bit in Virginia, at least, was Hurricane Agnes, which is 1972, I feel like, and that was a devastating storm to Virginia. Not just Virginia, but at least from our perspective, and being in Virginia, there was catastrophic flooding in Virginia from that storm. But there were a number of major hurricanes that occurred, and not just hurricanes, but at least there was a large focus on a lot of those major hurricanes that occurred. Camille was another one, I think, in that time frame. And so you start to see kind of a focus back to disaster preparedness and response to natural types of disasters and storms, and less on the civil defense kind of marketing and branding and outreach at this point. So
a question, you're from New York. What was the first hurricane you remember like living through or like being affected by?
Yeah, so here's funny. I'm from upstate New York. And
is that different? Did I mess up?
Well, it's different. Yeah. New York City is a city. It's a tiny little area with a bajillion people in it. And then upstate is this gigantic, nice, beautiful state with, it's cold. Yeah. It's cold, but it's a beautiful state. And it's, most people, I say New York, they think city. And so I clarify, upstate New York, Albany specifically, if anyone wants to research me and steal my identity. The first hurricane that I can remember was Isabel, which was a tropical storm, I think, by the time it hit in 2003 in Virginia, because in New York, I never even heard the term hurricane coming up that way. Yeah. Ironically, though, now that I think about it, Isabel, I was living in Fairfax at the time. I was going to George Mason University. So shout out to the Patriots. And I think it was like my first semester at George Mason, or second. I was just started. And I was actually in Herndon, I think, which is in Fairfax County. And we didn't really see the huge amount of impacts in Herndon because we were far enough west to kind of
off the coast.
Yeah, not get the coastal impact. But Isabel was a big deal, I remember, and I know you were working, I think.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so you had direct.
Well, I was going to say even before I was working, I think it was, I don't remember the date, I didn't look it up, but must have been 84 or 85. We had Hurricane Gloria come through Virginia. And of course, I'm like 5 years old at this time. Yeah. And I must have asked my parents, like, what's a hurricane? And they probably said, talking to a 4 or 5 year old, they probably said something like a tornado with water. So then I'm like, a 4 or 5-year-old, I'm picturing this in my head, and they say
Right.
it's coming. Then when it starts raining, of course, I'm like hiding under the bed.
It's
I can
here.
picture cows flying through the air and all
Right.
this other stuff. Not understanding the difference. But that was specifically, I remember that being the first one I lived through.
Okay.
And if I recall correctly, the last memory they had at that time was Agnes.
Okay, that would,
you know
yeah,
what I mean? So
that.
it was like 10 years later.
Right.
But that was the first one that I was personally affected by. It's
Yeah.
just being a kid and remembering hurricane. What's a hurricane?
Right.
And all of a
Right.
sudden it rains for 2 days. And
Yeah.
so on and so forth. But yeah, Isabel, I was working at the 911 center and I was in fire dispatch, and we had a neighborhood that when we get significant tidal surges, it floods.
Yeah.
And so I was doing fire dispatch on that channel. And just like you've heard, everybody's probably heard the stories about like Galveston and some of these other cities who had these large hurricanes. People are told your house is going to flood. Get out of your house. Right. They're not going to carry you out in handcuffs, but they're telling you leave because it's not safe. Well, lo and behold, 2:00 in the morning, we start getting calls from people who are trapped in their attic because the water is now above their second floor and they're in their attics to keep from drowning. Yeah. And so then we're sending, fire department through there, going house to house, pulling people out of their attics using Zodiac boats.
Yeah.
That went on for like 6 or 7 hours, I think. At least that part of that phase of it, the response. But that was the first one where I had like a work role as far as a hurricane goes.
Yeah. So. Yeah. I was just going to say, when I was a kid, definitely no hurricanes I can think of. I know there was Hurricane Bob, I think, hit Cape Cod, and I know my wife's family vacationed there every year. So I think that impacted them, I think, to some point. But
can I just say, out of all hurricane names, Hurricane Bob sounds pretty harmless.
Yeah, you would think. It was devastating, I'm pretty sure, to Cape Cod.
I'm sure. I have no idea about the facts around Hurricane Bob, but I just know that sounds different than if like Hurricane Thor's coming.
Yeah, right.
You know what
that
I mean?
Should be a name. That'd be pretty cool. Yeah.
We had a Winter Storm Thor.
We did. Yeah. We had blizzards, obviously, or like significant snowstorms. I can remember those as a kid. But I was going to say Hurricane Irene. That was what, 2012, I feel like. Yeah, I think 2012. So Irene actually did impact I wasn't living in New York at the time, but my parents' house. And I remember my parents, their basement flooded from the rain from Irene. And they had a lot of significant power outages and things like that because of just the remnants, I think, of Irene at that point had passed through the area. But that was interesting to me because I never had seen like a hurricane ever kind of make impact that far north before. Right. Even like Hurricane Sandy hitting New York City in that area and in New Jersey and stuff, that it didn't. I don't think it had major impacts in Albany, where my parents are, up further in New York, so Canada.
Yeah, not to get too far down this rabbit hole, but even like Tropical Storm Lee, which had a huge impact in this area in Virginia, just like you said about New York, Tropical Storm Lee didn't come the route where we usually get these storms in Virginia. Tropical Storm Lee came up through like Panhandle, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, and just came north across to the Midwest, then drifted east.
Yep.
So when it got to us, it wasn't a tropical storm. Officially, it was called, I think, the remnants of Tropical Storm Lee.
Yeah.
But it still carried the rainfall with it. It just meant that it wasn't moving as fast. So it would kind of hover over
which is worse. Yeah,
and ended up dropping, I want to say like 18 inches of rain in certain spots.
Yeah.
In Northern Virginia. So but it didn't come the normal, like coming up the coast. Here it comes. It's going to turn left. It didn't. None of those predictions mattered at that point.
Right. Yeah, that's I remember Lee just because I was in Stafford, I think, at the time. But in the fire department, I can remember getting the phone calls from Fairfax asking for swiftwater rescue boats. Yeah, and it was like, holy cow. So to get us back on, I guess, the kind of timeline. So we're in the 60s, 70s, major hurricanes impacting the United States. There is eventually so there's this Disaster Relief Act, and the Disaster Relief Act is actually the foundation that it gets amended and extended in a number of different timeframes to become what we know as the Stafford Act. And the Stafford Act is the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief Act, which is effectively kind of the legislation that emergency management today, modern day emergency management, really kind of ties back to on all things that we kind of do, but also, it creates, which you'll talk about, I think, more of, creates some of this formal process for getting assistance, and especially when it comes to the federal government. But the Disaster Relief Act was actually created, I think, all the way back in 1950, and the original version really just created this this ability for the president to declare disasters, and it kind of started bringing in some formality to the like, hey, we're actually going to acknowledge disaster has happened. President's going to declare that, and that kind of opened up some resources. All right, it's amended in 1969, which created, I thought was very interesting, the Federal Coordinating Officer concept.
Oh, I didn't know it was that old.
Yeah, I didn't either. And so this FCO concept, which is still around today, where there's basically a person that's sent on behalf of the federal government. In the originally in '69, it was meant to be basically the president's representation on the ground in the disaster area, and they kind of help coordinate. So it's a person you talk to, kind of, paired up with state or locality, usually a state entity, and is somebody you can talk directly to about recovery efforts and needs.
Federal resources.
Yeah, they're routing that up to the feds directly. So that was in 1969. And then in 1974, it was amended again, and that kind of created or added the ability for individuals and families to get direct assistance from the federal government. All right, so you kind of see, like, through this evolution of the Disaster Relief Act, the kind of also the evolution of what we know today, kind of common concepts of how this all works when it comes to major disaster and the federal government role in it, with primarily providing resources and funding to the states and the locals that are impacted by it. So I thought that was really interesting. And then as a kind of another big one, you have, so at the time, I guess through the 60s and 70s, even going back further, starting probably in the New Deal era, you start getting a lot of these government agencies that are created that have some role ultimately in disaster relief and response. And so by the time you get up into like the 70s, there's not hundreds, but there's maybe like 20 or 30 agencies in the federal government, all have like a piece of the role in providing something to the states and the locals when it comes to disaster assistance. So it's very fragmented at this point, I think. And the governors of all the states are complaining about this. Like, hey, when we need help, it's there's like,
that's unusual.
Yeah, like, it's complicated, and of course it's complicated. It's the federal government, right? So even then it was complicated. And they're like, basically, we need this to be simpler. It's too complicated. There's too many people to talk to. There's too much going on to try and get assistance. We need help here. And so President Carter, in 79, technically it starts in 78, but in 79 he officially creates FEMA. So the Federal Emergency Management Agency is created in 79, which is basically reorganizing a number of these kind of disparate federal agencies and bringing them under one umbrella as FEMA, as we know it kind of today. So it's not quite the same as it is today, but that's the beginnings of FEMA. And then we got to get up into the 80s. So that's kind of how this works for about a decade or so. And in 88 is when you get the amendment to the Disaster Relief Act that rebrands it as the Robert T. Stafford, or the Stafford Act, in 1988. And what that really does, I mean, it does a number of things, but that version of the act is what truly creates the process that we follow today, in which all disasters are local, and the local government's going to declare a local disaster. And if there's a lot of disaster impact at the local level, and it's overwhelming the locals, the state's going to get involved, and the state's going to declare a state of state disaster. And then if it's a really large event and the state's becoming overwhelmed, they're going to ask the president to make a presidential disaster declaration, which is what's going to then open up a number of levels of assistance from the federal government. And so that's I mean, I know I'm kind of like roughshotting a lot of that.
30,000 foot.
I'm trying not to cut. Right. Like, we could talk about it for a very long time, so I'm not trying to go into too much detail, but at a very kind of high level, that's the process as it works under the Robert T. Stafford Act. That's the process that works as it is today in from, at least from an assistance standpoint, when it comes to disasters. So that's kind of brings us up into I would say, somewhat modern times, because really nothing really changes with this process once the Stafford Act is put into place until, there are some things that come up in the 90s that are important, but really we fast forward kind of up to until 9/11, which I was realizing is the anniversary is tomorrow, as we're recording this anyway. And that event really reshapes the landscape when it comes to emergency management, and brings about, I would say, really a larger focus, nationwide on the concept of emergency management. And for most, I would say, local entities, is kind of the birth of something formal when it comes to emergency management in their jurisdiction.
Yeah, I think that one we didn't mention. We put together some notes prior to this and went back and forth, and one we didn't talk about, maybe because there wasn't a ton of legislation, or maybe there was and it wasn't as popular or known about. But Hurricane Andrew had also huge impact on response. How basically locals and states respond to things. So it's not so much from the legislative level, but there's a lot of things that we do now as far as damage assessment and things like that. When you get into specifics about the way things work, that came from Hurricane Andrew. And then when you get to 9/11, that's really based on the number of lives that were lost, the visibility, everything surrounding that situation. That's really when everything started to change.
Yeah. And it was right around I think probably post Hurricane Andrew is when, because when was that? 93, so maybe it was right before Hurricane Andrew. In the early 90s, the federal government does task FEMA, I guess, with creating the Federal Response Plan, which was the first time. That was the first, I guess, formal response plan that was created under the guise of FEMA, in which they were like, "Oh, this is how we're going to actually go out and respond to a disaster." And 9/11 was, for them, it was a disaster, and so they were like, we're going to implement the Federal Response Plan.
Right. And
there were a number of problems that arose from, that plan and how that worked, which is what I think then sparked, a massive overhaul in a lot of ways of emergency management and its response from a federal level post 9/11. Good and bad. There's some good and there's some bad with how that kind of worked. I had noted in my notes, because I thought this was interesting. I didn't know it. That under Bill Clinton, he actually had elevated the FEMA agency's, I guess, authority, and he appointed, I can't remember the gentleman's name now. There was a gentleman he appointed as the director of FEMA who was really credited for kind of bringing a lot more professionalism to the organization.
And it was a cabinet position.
And it was a cabinet level position, right? And so it had a lot more kind of direct authority, and it also it was always involved directly with the president in communicating, needs and disasters and things like that. Post 9/11, you have George Bush create the Department of Homeland Security, and I forget, easily forget like how new, I guess, concept DHS really is, because that's when it's created, and he takes FEMA and sticks it inside of DHS. Actually, it's like an agency within DHS. So it kind of loses its being FEMA, actually. It just becomes like Preparedness and Response Directorate, I think, under DHS or something to that effect. It's basically like a division within Homeland Security. And, that kind of takes us up into modern day, because then we have, once we get through, post 9/11, there's, a number of, there's a lot of legislation that's enacted that creates modern day emergency management at the local and state level, especially with things like NIMS and the National Incident Management System and things like that.
So. Yeah, and I'll get into some of that moving forward. I think one of the things that's interesting about DHS is I forgot until you just said it and talked about how old it was when that name first came up.
Yeah,
when they said Department of Homeland Security, like if you're a comic book fan, the first thing I thought of, did Hydra make this? Like the name, the name was like so unlike something American. Like why not the Department of Freedom or something?
Hail Hydra.
The Department of Homeland Security sounded again so sinister at the time, or something another country would name an agency. But you just mentioned how young it is, and and so just reminded. And the same thing, I think Coast Guard. There was a lot of agencies that had a lot to do with response, Border Patrol. a lot of the national security mission was brought under that one umbrella, for better or worse. In some cases it's good, in some cases maybe not optimized the way that various people in those agencies would tell you. But a couple of things happened after that. I mean, a quick story, 9/11, I had an instructor back in 2009 or 2010 that worked for FDNY and was a responder on 9/11. And, obviously they lost so many, brothers on that day, brothers and sisters, that they were wrecked, you know, and I think it was day 2 or day 3, he said, and the morale was just, as you can imagine, amazingly low. And he said, all of a sudden it was like, went from a cluster and everything started looking like, looks like we kind of know what we're doing here. We're doing good, because they were told, I've reported at a certain time. There was a stage built. Somebody gave him a briefing, handed out assignments, said what everybody's doing. And so he walked around with his chest puffed out the entire day going, we know what we're doing. We're getting good at this. It's only day 2 or 3 of the biggest, one of the biggest disasters in American history. And we're showing up. Right. And he's like, the next day he found out it was a wildland fire team that got flown in from like Iowa or something, and they had actually taken over behind the scenes and were starting to implement the incident command system. Right. And that's when he became a believer. Yeah. And he was like, well, this works. I've seen it work, and we need to keep doing it. We'll get into more of that later.
Oh, that's interesting.
He was a really, really good guy, and simplified a lot of things for me because I'm an idiot. But broke it down to a very basic level so that anybody can understand it. Right. So, which is always, what I say is, like, with most of emergency management, if you come with the personality, I can teach anyone to do it. Yeah. But it's about the personality and being able to make people want to work with you, which he's better at than I am. But still, the point stands. The point stands. So a couple things that came after that, after 9/11. So there was HSPD 5 and 8, which at the time were called Homeland Security Presidential Directive 5 and 8. Yep. I think under the Obama administration, they were reissued as Presidential Policy Directive 5 and 8 in 2011. So I always get them confused. I'm going to check my notes. Basically, HSPD 8 established the National Planning Frameworks. Yes. So the planning frameworks were basically issued or assigned to be written by FEMA, and it establishes plans for how the federal government does, protection, prevention, response, recovery, and mitigation. Yep. And it trickles down. So then the states have more detailed plans about how the states do things, and they all tie up. Locals do the same thing. So when you get to the local level, most locals have an emergency operations plan that kind of, you can track it up. Like the locals do it this way, the state does it this way to support the locals, and the feds do it this way to support the state. Yep. Is in general how those frameworks work. In addition, the Homeland Security Policy Directive, or PPD later on, 5, established the National Incident Management System as kind of the standard for how the entire country should be responding to all incidents, right, including special events and everything. So the idea there was that the focal point became the Incident Command System, which is the system that we use to do all these things. In addition, I think it was... No, I don't want to say something I'm not positive about. So the Incident Command System, establishing nomenclature for common resources, which we call resource typing, everything that goes with it. And really, a lot of that was stolen from, I mentioned wildland fire earlier. Yeah. Wildland fire teams out west, I think it started with maybe Cal, but there was a group called Firescope that created a committee that created this Incident Command System, and the typing, which we were just talking about, the common nomenclature and capabilities of resources and so on and so forth. And so that was established and basically mandated that this be done on all levels moving forward. Right. So now we have curriculums, teams, so on and so forth about how to do all these different things that are associated with the National Incident Management System. Yeah. Yeah. Makes sense?
It's like, I mean, you figure you had like you just said, you had a system kind of in place formally for wildland fire response, which for those that don't know, because we're not out west, but I'm sure there are people that are listening that are out west. There's a significant incident in a wildland fire, and it's a extremely large scale, and so they needed formal systems to kind of manage all that, and so they created it. And there's a lot of debate about that being, the actual birth of the incident command system. The military likes to claim they created it too, but we'll say yes. Wildland fire had its roots in it, and so you have 9/11 happen, and you start sending resources from all over the country to New York, to New York, and to DC for assistance with response and recovery, mostly recovery at that point. And they're all talking different languages. They don't understand the process. It's all different processes, and so obviously the need was there to kind of create something that's nationally implemented and recognized. So you can go from one state to another, from one jurisdiction to another, and in theory, understand at least what's happening, like how they're responding, what process they're using, what positions do, like that kind of stuff. And so hence, NIMS is a big part of that. And these presidential directives were, I'd like to do some research maybe someday to figure out like who was involved kind of at the federal level in the ear of, the cabinet or the president or whatever, saying like, hey, these are things we need to do. Like, this is a good idea. Like,
who had the ear of the president?
Yeah. Like, where'd that actually come from? I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah.
But it's based on your personal story too. It sounds like, it worked, right? Like that was, it made a lot of sense to do all this. And so, that's what we do now. I mean, that's how things are done. And like I say, and I like to say in theory, because, there is enough flexibility, I still think, in the incident command system is in itself, that even though there is some kind of standardization on how we implement the system, people tweak it. Right. And so it's maybe not a perfect, you go from one jurisdiction to another, it may not be the exact same, but you'll at least know enough to kind of figure out, all right, I understand what they're doing.
Well, I mean, I just thought of this on the fly, so if this is not a good comparison, I apologize in advance. But it's like, you go to a grocery store. Grocery stores in general function alike. All the details may not be the same.
Right.
But a cashier is a cashier. Somebody who works in the stock room works in the stock room. Yeah. What they call them, how they're dressed, all the overarching details are different. But the functions that need to happen to make these things survive, or this grocery store function, are all happening.
Right.
And that's kind of the way, regardless if people argue against, well, I don't do what the feds told me, I came up with my own system. And you can kind of sit in the back and go, yeah, it's the same.
Yeah,
right. They have a case of the butt about, the feds, or they don't like the system because they had a bad experience back in, 2004 or whatever. But when you start looking at what they're doing, you're like, yeah, this is still ICS. They're just calling it something different.
Called everything different, just make themselves feel better.
But ultimately, what I don't know if the intent was to have a mandate, or the intent was to do what I like to look at it as. It provided a set of tools. So the federal government now gives out training. FEMA gives out training and says, here's how to do these things. Here's how to operate within the National Incident Management System. For training, here's how to conduct exercises. Here's how to become a master exercise practitioner, so on and so forth. So they give out training for all this, and it's up to, like I said, trickling down the state and the locals to get on board and start doing those things. I think in our region, we still have individual holdouts, but for the most part, the culture is pretty good.
Yeah.
There are certain places you go to where maybe they don't like the federal government telling them anything.
Right.
And it's not this way. I'm not going to call out names. I'll just say it that way. So it's not that way. So, we can get in the ICS conversation, the incident command system, and maybe we'll do an episode on that and break out the flip chart and markers and just go nuts showing all this stuff. Because it's, it's pretty interesting, but, from my position in particular, I know somewhat for you as well, my job is basically to think in terms of the incident command system.
Right.
So anything that's happening, like, where is this going? What does the transition to a bigger event look like? And so on and so forth. Anything to add on that before I move on?
I was just going to say one other thing from PPD 8, so the frameworks, and you kind of alluded to, like, there's the 5 different areas. These frameworks are plans that basically the federal government was required to create for each of these mission areas, emergency management areas, as we call them.
Phases.
Phases, thank you. And those frameworks they basically replace what was originally that federal response plan. Mm-hmm. So the federal response plan in the 90s becomes effectively the national response framework eventually, is what that is. And so that's kind of the evolution there between those plans. And then we get into, everything works perfectly smooth.
Oh yeah,
country
never any problems.
Everyone's agreeing on the system. Yeah. Everyone wears the same color vests when they go out and deploy. Yeah. No problems there. Yeah. And then Katrina happens.
Yeah, Katrina. There was a lot of unique. Another personal story because he gives the information. I just tell stories. I guess a personal story. I remember during Katrina, which was in 05. 05? Yeah, 05. Mm-hmm. I was sitting. I was with my friend Eric. We were sitting on the couch watching a TV program. Which may be politically divisive, so I'm not going to say which one. But we were watching a TV program, and their guest star on an interview they had was with Anderson Cooper, and this was like the first night of Katrina, maybe the second night of Katrina, okay. And so he was in a neighborhood. I mean, the houses are just washed out, dead quiet, no power, and he's sitting there going, "Where's the government?
Right?
Where's the government? Where's the government?" And me and Eric are sitting just like we are, drinking beer, lazy, I have nothing to offer to anyone, but we're sitting there drinking beer and going, if I could take leave from work, I'd go carry sandbags or whatever needs to be done.
Right.
But like, we don't know any of this. Like, how do we even get involved?
What do we do? Yeah.
And so that was really the first time that emergency management, I mean, I knew we had at the time, a person in my county.
Yeah.
And the only time we saw her was when it snowed. She'd come in early and get on a conference call, that was it. But I knew one of the people I had worked with had gone to work for emergency management. So this is kind of when it hit my radar.
Okay.
Where I was like, FEMA, emergency management, like where are the locals? And if you remember, a lot of the stories were, about, first responders, maybe, I don't want to use derogatory terms, but not showing up for their duties, not reporting, whatever. Right. And, I know for us both, every time something happens now, because of Katrina, that's a concern.
Yeah.
It's always like, okay, is your family good?
Right.
Do they have food? Do they have water? Can you be here if something happens?
Yeah.
So personal preparedness for responders became a much bigger deal after Katrina.
Right.
Because if you can't take care of, your own personal situation,
you're not coming.
Even if you come to work, your brain's not going to be there.
Yeah.
So this is one of the things that we've emphasized over and over and over since. But from a legislative standpoint, everybody probably remembers the stories about the legends about the FEMA trailers and things like that from Katrina.
Yeah.
So there was the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act that was issued in 2006. And basically it was about establishing the support for a national disaster recovery strategy and a housing strategy. Because of that. So Katrina, you had the initial wave when the life safety issues, the water and everything else. But from a emergency management perspective, the more complicated part of this whole thing is once all the life safety stuff's gone, like when that stuff happens, you have fire department, police department, public works, transportation, agencies who respond, but aren't always known as first responders.
Yeah.
Agencies who respond will eventually get the life safety stuff dealt with.
Yeah.
And at some point, the life safety stuff's done. And the fire department's back at the fire stations, in theory. The police department's back on patrol, in theory. And, okay, now what?
Right.
You have all these neighborhoods that have been wiped out. Where do we put people? How do we feed people? Right. I mean, it's that part of the disaster is way longer and more complicated.
Way more complex, yeah.
Way more complicated than, my joke is, because I work for a fire department, my joke is always like the knuckle dragging, like put the wet stuff on the red stuff. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, that's the response. But everything after that is 25 times longer in actual time, and then significantly more complicated to try to pull off. So most of the reforms that came during the Katrina Reform Act were about the recovery and how to do that better in the future, so that we don't have some of the issues we had with the long-term housing and mass care, what we call mass care. So that, you have anything to add on that?
I think, I was going to say, one thing I thought was interesting, and I don't know if it is truly, this is just, I guess, Paul's maybe kind of perspective on it, reading
the world according to Paul.
The word calling to me, yes. You have, FEMA cabinet level position in the 90s. You have post 9/11. It's kind of hidden away in DHS and really kind of loses its, I would say, kind of identity there. Then kind of garners some of its identity back as FEMA, but still lives under DHS. And then you have Katrina happen, and you see this kind of gap in the federal response to Katrina for lots of reasons. And it makes me wonder, like, if that has something to do with it, or if that was related to, not to make it a political discussion, but it just is interesting that they coincide like that. And I do think that some of the legislation with Katrina is an attempt to kind of right maybe what was a mistake to some degree. And I know there's a lot of people out there raising the flag for that FEMA should be its own agency again and get out of DHS, which, I'm not saying that's wrong. But you kind of see like, oh, we may have messed this up a little bit. Like we buried them too far down, or we didn't give them enough authority here. And now you have this, major disaster, and, the response was broken at best, especially in the, I say response, but especially in the federal government response to the recovery needs of New Orleans and Louisiana, and like the whole area of the Gulf that was impacted by Katrina. So you see this in the legislation, I think, to some degree. Like in my notes I have here, they create the FEMA qualification system. Is that the NQS? Is that what you're talking about? Yeah, I think that's it might be the FQS, I guess.
Oh, okay.
Right? And they require kind of this. We want plans for what all the emergency support functions within the federal government, what their roles and responsibilities are. So like you're trying to like formalize like what people are supposed to be doing in these types of long-term disasters. partly, I think, because they realized, oh, we messed up here. Or somebody realized that. I don't know who. So you see that in this legislation a bunch. But yeah, that's about it. I think on that front.
So the last one I had down here, and honestly, I wasn't that familiar with it. So if I'm missing something, please chime in.
Right.
The Disaster Recovery Reform Act of 2018 was issued, or President Trump signed the act. And basically, the way it was described is it reduces the complexity of FEMA and increases our ability to respond to the next disaster. So I don't really have any idea what exactly is in that law, or if it's bigly awesome. I don't know.
It's hugely huge. It's a huge piece of legislation from what I could tell. I was also not as familiar with it. It's funny, like I know some of the bigger ones. This one is there. I don't know much about it myself. If you go on to the internets and look this one up, you can actually find they have like a number of reports that are created and issued about this Reform Act that kind of, I guess, report on the progress of what it's required and the actions that they've been taking to complete those. But yeah, it was like you said. I mean, overall, I think it was meant to, or at least its intent was to "quote unquote" reduce the complexity. That one I don't know much about other than that either. I think this is something that's still fairly new. I didn't even know it was something that really came about. I guess I don't know how I missed this one in just being in the field, but I definitely really didn't know much about this one prior to looking up the history of emergency management to some degree. And seeing it, and I was like, "What the hell is this?" Yeah. So yeah, thanks Trump for that one.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Throw that fastball over the plate.
Yeah.
I didn't know much about it either, and the fact that we haven't heard much about it probably means that it didn't change a whole lot of things. So a couple things that we're running up almost to an hour. I think that we've been talking here, and we can do this all day. If we had beer, especially, we could just keep going. And going.
Yeah, you can see we're drinking coffee.
This is coffee because he showed up at like 4:30. So it's early. It's early here, so we're still waking up. So a couple things, that to recap the highlights of what we're talking about, because our intent with the show is to make sure that everyone kind of gets a baseline of knowledge so that when we're talking about more complicated discussions, you understand the foundational aspects of it.
Right. So you can't skip episodes. That's
you have to watch all in order.
In order.
Take notes. There's going to be a quiz at the end. But one of the, I think you mentioned it, one of the foundation principles is the Stafford Act and the emergency declaration process.
Yep.
So you used the words, and I'm glad you did. Every incident is local. All right. And that's how it's treated across the country. So there is never an assumption that something bad happens and here's the feds to deal with it. Mm-hmm. That's not the way it works. That's not the way it's supposed to work. And that would be against the law if they did that. There are jurisdictions across the country where if the Fed showed up and tried to deal with something, they'd get run out at gunpoint. Oh, because there are states where, I'm from the federal government, I'm here to help is not an acceptable.
No, they don't want that.
It's not an acceptable answer. So every incident is local. When locals determine that they don't have the capability resource-wise to deal with that incident, they can declare, a disaster declaration, emergency disaster declaration. Then they can start asking for resources from the state because they've indicated formally that they don't have the ability to deal with this disaster. The state will start supporting.
Yep.
Then when the state is overwhelmed and can't support that disaster, then it goes to the federal government. The state will do a state declaration, and then the feds can start supporting. When the feds are getting tapped, or for various other reasons, there is some gray area there, they'll do a federal disaster declaration. And it allows them to support the state, to support the locals, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of minutia around that, but I think that's one of the foundation principles of everything we're going to talk about. So I just wanted to make sure that everybody is clear on that.
Yeah.
We skimmed very quickly over like the incident command system, the national incident management system, things like that. Those are whole shows. So if you had fun on this one, just wait. These are whole shows that we could talk about this stuff. And our hope is not to sit here and spit out facts or tell stories. But we want to bring in people for interviews and talk about experiences and things like that.
Yes.
But as we were talking before we started this, is we have to make sure the foundation is there, or else you're going to be going cross-eyed when they start talking. We don't want to make a show that's specifically for emergency management people. We want to make it.
Yeah, we're trying to broaden the audience. We wanted to. The whole point of this doing the show was to try and get those that are really not emergency management people interested, or got some understanding of what it is we do, and kind of broaden the field's maybe impact to some degree. Now we'll see how that goes. But, Yeah, we'll see. I was going to say, we don't want this to be like an ICS 300 or 400 class, which if you're in emergency management, you know what those are.
It's awful.
As a podcast. So that's not our intent either. We definitely want to make it a lighter, kind of more, interesting conversation as we go through and tell stories about what we do and how we do it, and maybe some of the reality behind some of the stuff. Like, it's not just how you read it in the textbook. Obviously, there's definitely some realism that will hopefully bring to some of these topics too. So I thought I was actually teaching. I was helping to teach an ICS 400 class recently, which is an emergency management course that we teach pretty often on a lot of these topics we talked about. And
advanced incident command for expanding incidents.
That's the one. Yeah. And I was talking about this local to state, state to feds, feds down to state, state down to local kind of concept, like we just talked about. And I was surprised, even, today, a lot of folks do think that when something bad happens, the federal government's just showing up, and that they're just going to kind of be there ready to assist. And, in reality, they probably are. If they see something's going to happen, they're moving resources around quite a bit, they're staging a lot of stuff and getting ready. But it's not. They don't just show up and start, acting. That's not how this is really meant to work.
They have to be invited, basically.
Yes, and so that's good. That's one of the foundations. Is always, everything is local. It starts local, and we always say it ends local. And that's important to understand, I think, so moving forward. But I was going to say, we wanted to talk about some real incidents too. We're running up on time, so not today, but maybe in a next episode, talk about the water crisis over in Jackson, Mississippi. Yeah. I was just interesting.
I saw a video of a tap earlier. I saw
did you? Yeah.
On TikTok or YouTube. So I'm like, oh, here's the water. And I was like, oh, that's
it's interesting. I do think, just to kind of comment on it for 1 second, I would say most people would probably be shocked if they were to look into how frail the public infrastructure is in a lot of places, even here in this area, where really one thing fails and then the whole system fails. And for things critical like water,
power,
water, gas, there are many things where you would be like, how is there a single point of failure here? You be shocked. There are probably many like that in the country. So something maybe to talk about a little bit next time.
Absolutely. So we're hitting an hour. I guess before we go, what's going on with you next week? What you got going?
I'm going to catch up. Hopefully this week's been weird for me because of the holiday, I think, from Monday. So I've been trying to catch up on everything. So later today, actually, I'm going down to see Wicked, the play.
Oh, really?
Yeah. That's what I've been doing. Taking the family down. I don't think I've mentioned I'm married. I have 2 kids, both of them 12 and 10. And we're all going down to see Wicked today. And then hopefully tomorrow, just chilling and watching football. And then next week, we'll see what it brings. I don't even know, to be honest with you, what I'm doing at work anyway. We got to get together next week at some point.
I'm on next week, man.
Oh, I forgot.
Yeah.
That's right. So podcast episode next one will probably be
the
next Tuesday after that. So it'll be a week gap. Can you say where you're going?
Yeah, sure. I'm going to the Emergency Management Institute, which EMI, or if you're a fire person, National Fire Academy, same facility in Emmitsburg, Maryland. I'm going with 7 people from the National Capital Region IMT and 7 others from the Hampton Roads IMT and Central Virginia IMT. We're going to R325, which is the number. FEMA numbers everything. So it's a class, which basically is an evaluated class / exercise, which will qualify our people for Tier 1 Type 3 deployments, which is a whole nother thing, and we don't have time today.
No.
But it's a pilot class. We're the first group to go through it. So it's pretty exciting. We'll be able to, hopefully we'll be evaluated successfully and get the credential, but hopefully also can offer some feedback to that program to make sure that, future classes going through it are being held to a certain standard.
Yeah.
Without anything getting watered down.
Right.
I'll be doing that Monday, actually tomorrow. I'm leaving tomorrow and I'll be back on Friday, probably Friday morning. And so that'll be interesting. Maybe I'll spend 5 minutes talking about whatever we experienced during that. But these are the type of things I was saying we want to talk about eventually, but it requires building to it. Because if I start talking about that now, anybody, even EM people, may just go, I don't know what's happening.
What's going on here?
Because it's even inside of emergency management, when I'm talking about like incident management teams and stuff, it's we're not smart, but we practice certain things, and it it's a very specific skill set.
It's a niche.
It's a niche. Yeah. It's like being an IT guy in emergency management.
Yeah.
It's a niche.
It's a niche. Valuable one too.
Yeah, if you say so. You would say so.
I would, yes.
So at some point we'll get back to that, and we'll we'll start filling everybody in on how that stuff works once we've laid the foundation for it.
Yeah.
So that being said, you want to close it out before we get out of here?
Yeah, I was gonna say. So if you're at EMI next week and
I'll be at the Command Post Pub.
Yeah, you
every
hear
night,
karaoke.
Thursday night karaoke.
Yeah, you hear someone singing
time.
like anything '90s hip hop related. It's this guy. So go say hi to him. And I'm gonna. So we've been talking about like creating like a tagline out of this thing. So I think I'm gonna say,
"Stay classy, San Diego."
That would be perfect. I was
Stay
gonna
classy,
say. I'm gonna say, "Stay classy, survivors, and keep on surviving."
Nice. All right, everybody. Catch you next week.
All right.